Hi, I'm Peter Buckle, and this is Design Office Hours, a podcast about design, designers, and careers in design. I talk about creating, leading, and navigating creative work at this place we call work. Whether you're a student just starting out or an establishing designer navigating the world of design, welcome to this podcast. This show, as you know, is also about your input, so send in your topics and questions and remarks and whatnot. How to get in touch with me in the show? Email me at designofficehours@peterbuckle.com or follow and send me messages on Instagram at Design Office Hours. And last but not least, head over to peterbuckle.com/designofficehours to sign up for my mailing list to get notified about new episodes and other stuff that we're going to do here. All right, welcome back to this show. It has been a little bit of a break. I was busy relocating around the planet. I'm recording now from wonderful Thailand in the wonderful laid-back city of Chiang Mai. And we will continue this podcast heading into the second season. The first season had 10 episodes. I thought that I should call this seasons and just package this nicely up in 10 episode packages. Season sounds very sophisticated, I feel. Anyway, so for today, what do we have on the menu? We have, as usual on this podcast, so far we have a question here. And the question is, how do you assess if a designer can apply critical thinking successfully on a project? All right, critical thinking. Let's talk about this. I probably addressed this to some extent in previous episodes when I talk about portfolio and what I'm looking at and, how we eventually assess somebody's performance or work that's in front of us, but also how we want to figure this out in an interview, right? So I think demonstrating your ability to critical think or to what extent this ability is formed using the portfolio works. It's usually your entry, but then also during an interview, I think that's actually where you can shine with this, the way you talk, the way you frame, the way you explain things, right? And obviously it's not about lying, but be truthful. But I think from previous experience, too few people actually make this a point. So surely that has to do with being eloquent and etc. and just being able to talk about your work. But a lot of people or a lot of designers, applicants don't really make it a point how they differentiate it in this or that solution. And I think it's, to me, still surprising how much we focus on the end product or the end result, right? And a portfolio and an interview, and not talking about the process. Well, everything I want to know is actually about the process. So let's go into a few points and work our way through this about this critical thinking thing. Problem framing. Can someone define the right challenge? In an interview, you could lead with this, like, I got vague input here, sort of was all or nothing. And, I went back and asked the right question before jumping in. I paused. I was the one who worked up a few questions, a little framework, and sort of reframed a very vague brief into a clear problem statement or multiple. And I went back to this person that sent it out initially. So showing awareness of user needs, constraints, and eventually, at best case, putting the business in there, business goals, and weaving this all together, right? If you're sort of doing this and, again, pushing back on input that is unclear or is not framed right or simply is missing out parts, I think that would be a good sort of way in to say, well, here's where I applied my critical thinking, right? And then go further. I would look for, do people find new angles and add new approaches to a known problem? Maybe that applies a bit later when we're actually talking design process and how you sort of went over something to, attack this design problem that obviously ideally came from a well-defined brief and maybe something that you also helped to co-write because you are a critical thinker. So again, illustrating this, talking about it, laying it all out, I think is important. Another part is, so I now talked about problem framing. A second part would be decision making. And I said this before in this podcast, I'm always very interested in how people make decisions. I think that's something I'm interested in beyond design. What is the reasoning why somebody went left or right or did this or that, especially when there's, to me, like no obvious reason. So I'm generally fascinated by this. And so here I would say, how do you justify your design choices? What was the reasoning here? Why did you go this way or that way? Especially when it comes to, one of my favorite questions is when people talk about their design and their shape and it's amazing. And I'm like, okay, I get it. And then I ask, so why is it this shape? And people get confused. What do you mean, why this shape? I'm like, yeah, why is it this shape? What's the reason? Tell me, why is it this shape? and not any other shape of all the, well, apparently thousands of possible shapes? Why did you choose this detail? What does it communicate? I don't believe there should be anything random in it. Everything has a reasoning here. Maybe it's derived from a design language that's in place and you interpreted it further this way, right? There were constraints on maybe the engineering side on why something couldn't be done this way, and hence you did it this way, and here's why you think it's still okay and why this is a good solution. So that often goes along with showing the people, again, in portfolio or in an interview, what were your constraints, which is my next question usually is like, what were the constraints? What were you not allowed to do? And I think leading with this and talking about critical thinking, sort of in line with this, I think it usually goes a long way. How do you present a structured rationale behind your form, function, materials? Don't let this to be random, right? And it's okay if you didn't have much choice, if you were presented with a very narrow space of operating in, then make this front and center. Tell people this was the reality here. This is what I had. I made the best out of it. In fact, this is often happening when you work in an office on a design job. It's not that the sky's the limit. Cost is a constraint. Time is a constraint. Engineering resources is a constraint. Design resources is a constraint. It's full of constraints. So I want to know, how did you work within those constraints? And then have you demonstrated an iterative process, refining ideas based on your insights, right? Going back to process and obviously weaving in everything that I said so far. So demonstrating this process, explaining the decisions, where were the fork in the road moments, where did you go here versus there? What forced you to go here or there? And how did you come back from it? And also how did you, again, even in that process, question your stakeholders? You're in the middle of a project and you're at this point and you're taking everything face value, or you're going back and working this from a design angle. The third part I would put in this bucket of critical thinking, adaptability. How well is somebody in adapting to unexpected changes? And there's a multitude of what can happen, right? So I would say on a project, there's a new constraint that appears. Budgets seldom get bigger. They usually get smaller, same for timelines. That's not true. Sometimes they get longer, but then some other thing happened. How did you continued managing this, or pivoted, or worked it differently? What did you change? Or maybe also not change, but we're aware of, right? So illustrate, explain this delta that you use to make your decision. And if you pivoted, then talk about it. Do you have, again, that goes along with, do you have a flexible mindset, or do you stick rigidly to the initial ideas and you sort of like die on the hill? I think a flexible mindset is key, obviously, in this case. I think it's a fine balance between having a flexible mindset, at the same time asking and sort of inquiring why to bend over backwards here now, and is it worth it? If everything is in line and is required to do it, then you have the ability, obviously, to do this because you have a flexible mindset. But it doesn't mean that we're like going left because somebody says left, right? Going back to my first point, okay, go back and reframe it. Really work out if there's no reason to pivot on your end particularly, right? Of course, if the whole project pivots, then you're having a hard time, the only one standing, saying, well, but I'm continuing on this path. So flexible mindset or set on ideas, I think it's important. Also, when you talk about design process and you have your sort of first set of ideas developed, right, you go broad. Are you flexible to go back and forth? When it's just you or just a design team, you don't have to necessarily navigate a whole field of people. That's a different challenge. But if it's a fairly small team, how flexible also are you particularly in the team? Again, this example of like, I have 10 ideas, I go with 5, figure out there was another one further back, I'll go back. So this flexibility of oscillating between ideas at different stages in the process. And then also, how do you, speaking of projects and to work with other people, how are you able to respond to these real world limitations, right? I mentioned earlier already a little bit, budgets change, technologies change, people change, leaders change, or timelines change. How are you, give me an example. This happened to you. Everything was out of your control. What did you do, right? Did you go have a meltdown and didn't come to work for 2 days? Or did you regroup, talk this through, maybe even looked for a senior person to help you navigate this, right? Did your boss step in, help to write this because, again, things were out of your control? I think this gives usually a lot of insight about how a person just works with other people and is reacting to these things. Again, make that visible. If not in a portfolio, then in an interview. Some of them, these things lend themselves better than others to be in a portfolio or in a interview. I always appreciate if a portfolio has sort of like illustrations or a good explanations and let me easily understand, okay, interesting. He started here, then he went there, didn't work. I think it sort of is a good first foot in the door. The last but not least is depth of exploration. I think this is something where maybe critical thinking is applied on the fly and you do it on an intuitive basis, right? You're questioning, you built the prototype, you just look at it and you think it through without even realizing that you're thinking it through. So do you show a range of perspectives? I think that's important for any designer at any job at any stage. Because we're often find ourselves taking on the perspective of somebody else. We're doing empathy exercise, trying to look at the problem from a business point of view, from a financial point of view, engineering point of view, right? That's what we do. We're wearing multiple hats and we're sometimes trying on other people's shoes. So I think that sort of range of perspectives is important. So I would ask you, for example, have you explored multiple solutions instead of settling on the first idea? It goes a little bit back to the previous point of like you're working 10 problems. How flexible are you going back, right? There are people that are getting obsessed with an idea and then take it and run it. And, it's a gamble. It can go well, can also not go well. And you have to go back to the previous one, but it's a far longer way to go back to the previous one because, well, you thought you can handle this. And eventually in the worst case, you dragged in a bunch of other functions and people and they all stormed after this idea. And later somebody says, well, it's sub-ideal here, here, and here. And it doesn't work at all at this point. So being critical about what you're doing on your own desk, on your own environment. So, and then do you integrate insights from the other folks that you work with? Naturally, you work with other people. As I said, design is a team sport. Right. So different disciplines, different angles, different opinions, research, etc., etc. They also ideally they come all, the more fundamental one, especially research, ideally comes at the beginning of a project. But, as it can happen and as a team learns, things are easier, better understood later in the process. So there is here and there a different angle introduced, a different opinion from a different function, right? So how well do you work with this and how well do you integrate this? And again, how well do you also push back eventually and say, well, my critical thinking every year right now is like, I hear you. Indeed, that's a good point. But eventually I need to inquire a little bit more here because I'm not convinced right now, right? That we're that far in the process, have to take care of this part or that this is relevant. So as designers, being able to do that is critical. And often we also find ourselves being the only ones on a team actually doing this. We are, and comes to the one or other person more easily, the devil's advocate, who is just posing the opposite question of like, yeah, but what if not? Right? I think that's can be a valuable contribution to a group of people. It's to me fascinating often how well a group of very smart people can talk themselves into a very bad idea. If you're able to observe this, do it. It's great fun to watch. But I think, again, as I said, that there's a great deal of just sometimes being the devil's advocate and just being not the naysayer, but being the critical inquirer. And this is not always easy. Sometimes you need a thick skin. Again, it also depends it matters how you do it. You do it professionally, of course, right? But it's your ability to critically think for others, for a team. All right, that's it for this episode. I hope this is helpful in the realm of critical thinking. As you go onwards, try to observe yourself. Where do you think critically more and where do you think critically less? Figure out where does it apply right now and where do you still need to apply it and take it from there. I hope this was helpful and I hope I see you all in the next episode.